Right now, after nearly a full day of high-level negotiations, the most anticipated diplomatic breakthrough between the United States and Iran has quietly collapsed. Delegations walked out. No agreement, no roadmap, no clear next step. And yet, the stakes could not be higher. The talks in Pakistan were supposed to de-escalate a region already on edge. Instead, they may have exposed something deeper, something more fragile, something that doesn't add up. Because this was not just another failed meeting. It was one of the rare direct engagements between two adversaries that have avoided open war for decades. And still, after 21 hours, both sides left with nothing but accusations. The real question is, why did it fail so completely? And what this could mean is far more than a diplomatic setback. It could signal that the last remaining channels of trust are no longer working at all. The meeting took place in Islamabad, Pakistan. It lasted around 21 hours. It brought together senior representatives from the United States and Iran. On the American side, the delegation was led by Vice President J.D. Vance. On the Iranian side, leadership came from high-ranking political figures, including the parliamentary leadership. This alone signals how serious the moment was. Direct talks at this level are rare. In fact, they have been largely absent for decades. The goal was clear: de-escalation. A fragile ceasefire had been holding across parts of the Middle East, but pressure was building. Regional tensions were rising. Israel continued military operations in Lebanon. Iran maintained a strategic posture around the Strait of Hormuz. The United States increased its military presence in the region. All sides were moving, but not necessarily toward peace. Here's why this matters. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical choke points in the global energy system. A significant portion of the world's oil passes through it. Any disruption here does not stay regional. It becomes global almost instantly. And according to the report, Iran continued to assert control over this area during the talks, signaling leverage rather than compromise. But this is where it gets serious. According to the U.S. delegation, the core issue was trust. The American side claimed that Iran was unwilling to accept key conditions, especially those tied to its nuclear program. These conditions were not minor, they were central. For Washington, any agreement without nuclear concessions would be meaningless. Iran, however, presented a different narrative. Their officials argued that the United States failed to create a credible environment for negotiation. They described the demands as unrealistic. From their perspective, the issue was not refusal, but imbalance. They saw the negotiation framework itself as flawed. And this changes the equation. Because when both sides walk away blaming each other's lack of trust, it suggests something deeper than policy disagreement. It suggests that the negotiation space itself may no longer exist. The timeline reinforces this. The talks followed weeks of escalating tension. A temporary ceasefire had created a narrow window. This meeting was supposed to use that window. Instead, it closed it, and it closed it without even a partial agreement. At the same time, parallel developments continued. Israel maintained military pressure in Lebanon. Regional actors remained active. The United States signaled readiness to escalate if necessary. Iran maintained its strategic posture. No one stepped back. Here's the critical point. This was not just a failed negotiation. It was a test of whether diplomacy could still function under pressure. And based on the outcome, that test did not go well. So now the question becomes more uncomfortable. If direct talks at the highest level cannot produce even minimal alignment, then what options remain? To understand why the talks failed, you have to look beyond the statements. Because on the surface, both sides point to familiar issues: nuclear demands, security guarantees, regional behavior. But underneath, the structure of the negotiation itself reveals something more rigid. First, there is the issue of leverage. Iran entered the talks while maintaining control over the Strait of Hormuz. This is not just geography, it is pressure. It is a signal that Iran still holds a critical card in any negotiation. By not stepping back from that position, Iran was effectively negotiating from strength, not compromise. This changes how every demand is perceived. At the same time, the United States approached the talks with clear conditions, especially regarding Iran's nuclear program. These were not flexible guidelines. They were core requirements. From Washington's perspective, any deal without these concessions would fail to address long-term risk. So the U.S. position was also rigid, but in a different way. It was anchored in security doctrine. Here's where the friction begins. One side is leveraging geography and regional influence. The other is leveraging long-term strategic concerns. These two forms of leverage do not align easily. They operate on different timelines. Iran focuses on immediate regional control. The U.S. focuses on future risk. But this is where it becomes more complex. Trust is not just about intentions. It is about sequencing. Who moves first? Who gives something up first? And according to the report, neither side was willing to take that initial step. The U.S. demanded nuclear concessions up front. Iran expected a shift in pressure and recognition of its position first. This creates a deadlock structure, because if both sides require the other to move first, the system freezes. And that appears to be exactly what happened during the 21 hours of negotiation. But this is not just about two countries. The environment around the talks also played a role. While negotiations were happening, military activities in the region did not stop. Israel continued operations in Lebanon. The U.S. maintained military readiness. Iran held its strategic positions. This means the talks were happening under active pressure, not in isolation. And this changes the dynamic entirely. Negotiations under pressure are not neutral. They are influenced by ongoing signals. Every military move becomes part of the negotiation. Every deployment becomes a message. So even if discussions at the table were controlled, the reality outside the room was escalating. Here's why this matters. It suggests that diplomacy was not operating independently. It was embedded inside a broader system of pressure and deterrence. And in that system, compromise becomes harder, not easier. There is also the issue of expectations. This meeting was described as one of the most significant direct engagements in decades. That raises the stakes. It creates pressure for results. But it also increases the cost of concession, because any agreement at that level would be highly visible, politically sensitive, difficult to reverse. So both sides faced a dilemma: concede and risk internal backlash, or hold position and risk collapse. Based on the outcome, both chose to hold. And this is where the deeper pattern appears. The failure was not sudden. It was built into the structure of the negotiation. Conflicting leverage, misaligned timelines, no agreed sequencing, external pressure, high political cost. Put all of that together, and the result becomes less surprising. But this leads to a more difficult question. If the structure itself makes agreement unlikely, then was the outcome already determined before the talks even began? The details from the meeting itself reinforce this pattern. The talks lasted approximately 21 hours. That is not a symbolic meeting. That is a sustained negotiation attempt. It suggests that both sides were engaged, at least initially. But duration does not equal progress. In this case, the length of the talks may actually highlight how deep the disagreement was. According to the U.S. delegation, the central issue was Iran's unwillingness to accept key conditions. These conditions focused heavily on the nuclear program. This was not presented as a secondary issue. It was described as a core requirement. From the U.S. perspective, this is consistent. Any long-term agreement without addressing nuclear capabilities would be structurally weak. But the Iranian response tells a different story. Iranian officials stated that the United States failed to build trust. They described the demands as unrealistic. This is important, because it shows that Iran did not reject negotiation itself. It rejected the framework of the negotiation. Here's why that distinction matters. Rejecting negotiation means no engagement. But rejecting the framework means engagement is possible, but only under different terms. This creates a situation where both sides are technically willing to talk, but unable to agree on how to talk. Another key detail is the role of Pakistan. The talks took place in Islamabad, with Pakistan acting as a host and intermediary. This indicates that there was an attempt to create a neutral ground, a controlled environment. But even with a third-party setting, the outcome did not change. This suggests that the problem was not location or mediation. It was structural. At the same time, developments outside the negotiation room continued to escalate. Israel carried out ongoing military operations in Lebanon. This was happening in parallel. It added pressure to the regional environment. It also indirectly affected Iran's strategic calculations, because Iran is not negotiating in isolation. It is negotiating while its regional network is active. And this changes how every decision is made. If Iran perceives itself under regional pressure, it is less likely to concede. If the U.S. sees continued regional escalation, it is less likely to relax its demands. Both sides become more defensive, not more flexible. There is also the issue of signaling. During the talks, Iran maintained its posture around the Strait of Hormuz. This was not reduced or softened. It remained in place. This is a form of strategic communication. It signals capability. It signals readiness. And it signals that Iran is not negotiating from a position of weakness. From the U.S. side, the presence of a high-level delegation led by the vice president also sends a signal. It shows seriousness. It shows commitment. But it also raises expectations. When a figure at that level is involved, the outcome becomes more visible, more politically sensitive, and more difficult to adjust quietly. Here's the critical point. Every element of this case points to the same conclusion. The talks were real. The engagement was real. But the gap between the two sides was not just wide. It was structured. And this is where it becomes unsettling. Because if both sides fully participated, used a neutral location, engaged for nearly a full day, and still failed to produce even a partial agreement, then the issue is not effort. The issue is alignment. And right now, that alignment appears to be missing entirely. What happens when diplomacy fails at this level does not stay contained. It expands. Quietly at first, then systemically. And in this case, the implications move far beyond the negotiation room in Islamabad. The most immediate pressure point is energy. The Strait of Hormuz remains under Iranian influence. This is not just a regional detail. It is a global vulnerability. A significant share of the world's oil flows through this narrow passage. Any disruption, even the perception of disruption, affects markets almost instantly. Prices react. Insurance costs rise. Shipping routes adjust. And uncertainty spreads faster than any official statement. Here's why this matters. The talks were supposed to reduce that uncertainty. Instead, their failure reinforces it. If Iran continues to assert control, and the United States signals potential countermeasures, the risk is no longer hypothetical. It becomes operational. And once that happens, global supply chains begin to feel the pressure. But this is where it gets more serious. The failure of the talks also reshapes regional calculations. Israel is already conducting operations in Lebanon. That continues in parallel. Without a diplomatic channel between the U.S. and Iran, the risk of indirect escalation increases. Not necessarily through direct confrontation, but through proxies, through overlapping operations, through miscalculation. And this changes the equation. Because regional conflicts do not escalate in a straight line. They expand through connections. One front influences another. One decision triggers a response elsewhere. And without a functioning diplomatic buffer, these connections become more volatile. There is also the issue of military posture. The United States has already increased its presence in the region. That is part deterrence, part preparation. Iran, meanwhile, maintains its strategic positioning. Neither side is stepping back. Instead, both are reinforcing their positions. This creates a feedback loop. More presence leads to more tension. More tension leads to more presence. And over time, this loop becomes harder to break. Another layer is perception. The failure of such a high-level negotiation sends a signal to other actors. It suggests that even direct engagement at the highest level cannot guarantee progress. That affects how other countries interpret the situation. It affects alliances. It affects decision-making across the region. For smaller states, this creates uncertainty. For larger powers, it creates opportunity and risk at the same time. Because when two major actors cannot reach agreement, the space between them becomes unstable. And this instability is not limited to the Middle East. Energy markets are global. Security perceptions are interconnected. A disruption in one region can shift policies in another. Defense spending, alliance structures, trade routes. All of these begin to adjust, sometimes quietly, sometimes rapidly. Here's the critical point. The failure of the talks is not just about what did not happen. It is about what becomes more likely now. Increased tension, reduced communication, higher risk of miscalculation. And when those elements combine, the system does not collapse immediately. It becomes fragile. But a fragile system is often more dangerous than a broken one, because it continues to operate right up until the moment it doesn't. At first glance, this looks like a familiar failure. Two adversaries meet. They disagree. They walk away. But if you look closely at what actually happened, a different pattern begins to emerge. This was not just a breakdown in negotiation. It was a breakdown in the ability to even define a shared reality. The United States framed the talks around long-term risk, especially the nuclear issue. Iran framed the talks around immediate pressure, sovereignty, and trust. Both positions are internally consistent. Both are grounded in their own logic. But they are not operating within the same framework. Here's why this matters. Negotiation only works when both sides agree on what the problem is. Not just the solution, but the problem itself. In this case, that agreement appears to be missing. And this changes everything. Because without a shared definition of the problem, every proposal becomes misaligned. Every concession feels insufficient. Every demand feels excessive. The gap is no longer just political. It becomes structural. But this is where it becomes more unsettling. The failure of the talks suggests that this gap is not temporary. It may be persistent. It may be built into how both sides now view the world. The United States is operating from a position that prioritizes control over future threats. Iran is operating from a position that prioritizes resistance to current pressure. These are not just policies. They are strategic mindsets. And strategic mindsets do not shift easily. Here's the deeper implication. If both sides continue to operate within these fixed frameworks, then future negotiations may follow the same pattern. Engagement without alignment. Dialogue without resolution. And over time, this creates a dangerous illusion. The illusion that diplomacy is still functioning, when in reality, it is no longer producing outcomes. This is where the real risk begins. Because when diplomacy appears to exist, but fails to deliver, decision-makers begin to look for alternatives. And in a region already under pressure, those alternatives are rarely neutral. They are usually force. So the real insight is not just that the talks failed. It is that the mechanism for resolving tension may be weakening. And if that mechanism continues to erode, the system does not just become unstable. It becomes unpredictable. After 21 hours of direct engagement, the outcome was silence. No agreement, no framework, no indication that the next round will be any different. On paper, it is a failed negotiation, but in reality, it may be something more consequential. Because what this moment reveals is not just disagreement, but disconnection. Two sides talking, but not converging. Two strategies moving forward, but not intersecting. Here's why this matters. The system still appears stable, ships still move, forces remain in position. Communication channels technically exist, but underneath, the conditions that allow stability to hold are weakening, and this is where it becomes difficult to ignore. The failure of this meeting does not end the conversation. It changes its nature. It shifts it from structured diplomacy to uncertain signaling, from controlled negotiation to reactive positioning. The question is no longer whether tensions exist. That is already clear. The real question is whether there is still a reliable way to manage them. And right now that answer is unclear. Because when trust is no longer sufficient and alignment is no longer possible, the system does not collapse immediately. It drifts, slowly, quietly, until something forces it to stop. And when that moment comes, it rarely looks like a negotiation.